Much has been happening in Kashmir Valley lately. Unfortunately, too much bad news has been coming, and that's why this week's National Interest is looking at that situation. It's also making an assessment of Modi government's Kashmir policy because they had promised to make a difference, a radical difference to India's handling of Kashmir. We are also trying to assess this week in this National Interest how this has worked. So, on its third anniversary, the second Modi government right now has been flaunting its achievements and successes. It's also a good time, therefore, to ask if its Kashmir policy is a success, failure, or more of the same. We mean, as Indian governments are accused by the BJP of having done in the past, which is muddling along. So, is Modi government's policy successful, a failure, or if this government also is just muddling along? Now, if we get the recent targeted killings in Kashmir, which are making headlines, especially of outsiders and Kashmiri pundits, inform our assessment, our judgment, you'd be inclined to call Modi government's policies in Kashmir a failure. We will, however, sidestep that temptation for three reasons. And what are these three reasons? One, policy of appraisals must never be episodic. They should not be, our appraisal of a long-term problem should not be determined by what happened in today's headlines, what we read in today's headlines, what the fight was over on today's prime time debates. Two, violence in Kashmir Valley needs to be seen in its geographical perspective. Second, geographical I mean because Pakistan is next door, there is a line of control and that's a live area. Second, we aren't news TV channels to jump at these and declare apocalypse now, the return of 1990 and so on. We hold our fire. And three, if anyone thought Kashmir was resolved with that 5th August 2019 decision on its constitutional status, they must reread Kashmir 101. They must go back to school and read Kashmir 101. Now, the constitutional changes that were made in 2019, these were celebrated by the BJP RSS faithful as the fulfillment of one of their key ideological goals. They said Ram Mandir is done, now Article 370 is done, Uniform Civil Code is a work in progress, step by step we'll get there. Now, if you've been following my work, my writings and what I've been saying, you might remind me also that I too hailed that decision as an audacious positive one. The decision to change Article 370 and to change the constitutional status of Kashmir, essentially to take away its special status in the Indian Constitution and in the Indian Republic. Now, as this week's argument unfolds, I will also explain why I remain steadfast on that view. I will also explain to you its limitations because that change was important, but that change also had limitations. Numbers from the valley are also available now and lend themselves to comfortable both-sidisms. So we can say, if you look at the total number of mostly targeted civilian killings this year, or maybe we begin from 5th October last year. Let's take that as the starting point because that is when Mr. M.L. Bindru, the popular chemist in Kashmir Valley in Srinagar, who had refused to go away even after the earlier ethnic cleansing, he was assassinated. So if you start counting from 5th of October 2021 until now, Kashmir Valley has seen 29 targeted killings, right? 29 killed is 29 too many, but it's 29 killings. Now, as we explained in an earlier episode of Cut the Clutter, episode 1013, you can check it out, I'll share a link with you. This number isn't at all remarkable either on the high or low side compared to the norm in the valley. In fact, if you look at the data on the South Asia Terrorism Portal, SATP, we had said in that Cut the Clutter, if there is one thing that's remained stable in Kashmir Valley since 2010, it's the number of civilian killings every year. Even in the 4 years before Narendra Modi government was voted in with a majority, the number had varied between about 19 to 34 per year. That's how it has continued under the two Modi governments also, except in 2018 when it went up to 86. The number of killings has neither risen generally nor declined. if the valley situation was hellish before May 2014, it isn't heavenly now, or vice versa. So why do we say this lends itself to both sidism? So if you are on Mr. Modi's side, you will say, "Arey, 30-35 तो मरते हैं, only 30-35, it isn't as if the world is coming to an end." If you are not on Mr. Modi's side, if you are his critic, then you will say, "See, he came to power saying, I will give terrorists a hard time, I will finish them, but the level of killings is the same as before, so what has he achieved?" So you can make your choice. I am sharing the facts with you. And I am drawing my own opinion and my own conclusions from these. Now, hand on your heart. Put your hand on your heart if you are a Modi BJP supporter and tell me something. Aren't you disappointed at the continuation of more of the same old in the valley? When Modi and his party campaigned for 2014, they had promised a much tougher approach on Kashmir, throwing out the waffling of the past, the plight of the Kashmiri Pandits, and how secular parties failed them in 1990, never mind the fact that VP Singh government then only survived on outside support of the BJP, but the plight of the Kashmiri Pandits and how secular parties failed them in 1990 was held out as an example of weak governance, of namby-pamby governance by Indian governments on Kashmir. A Modi government would show the terrorists, whether they are Indian or Pakistani, that their business was now over. Month after month, since then, since August 5, 2019, the terrorists have demonstrated that they do not think so. They do not think that their business is over. If anything now, the wide and wild celebration over the film The Kashmir Files has given them a strategic opening. The film, which enjoys such massive patronage from the BJP establishment, it proves, or it seeks to prove, that the Kashmiri Pandits suffered killings and the valley's version of ethnic cleansing, which was reality by the way, in 1990 because India had a weak, cowardly government. What will you call the current government now? If the terrorists resume killing the same Kashmiri Pandits again, unleashing another flight by them. Now, let's not be confused by tourist and Amarnath pilgrimage numbers. There have been many good years on those parameters in the past, in the 2 decades in the valley. The test in the valley is whether you can make it safe enough for outsiders to work there and for the Pandit natives to return. Then you can say the valley is back to normal and it's safe. Now, events of the last many weeks have told us, have proved to us that that is not the case. That hasn't happened. Again, if you are a Modi government fan or Modi government enthusiast and mad at me for daring to tell it as it is, the question you are likely to throw at me is something like, how do you expect Modi to fully normalize a situation messed up over 70 years by Nehru, Gandhi, Abdullah, Mufti dynasties and the Pakistanis and Islamic radicalism and so on and so forth? It will take time. You've got to be patient, Shekhar Gupta, which precisely is my point. The problem originates in the belief that somehow independent India's true history only began in the summer of 2014. Everything that came to pass before that was a compromise on the national interest and national security. Once you make that assumption, you would expect history to begin afresh everywhere, including in Kashmir Valley, Uri, Balakot, Article 370, the Kashmir Files. You got much to celebrate. And then you find your daily headlines are more of the same. Flight of the Hindus, especially Pandits. Now TV generals, who appear on TV channels, retired generals, they are furious just like before, as in UPA times. Teach the Pakistanis a lesson. Launch a holy war on this unholy jihad mindset and so on and so forth. Now, it is my moment, therefore, to turn your question onto you. Did you really expect this chronic issue between 2 nuclear-armed neighbors which has defied solution for 75 years, and these are 2 neighbors with very strong armies and total distrust between them, to be resolved just because you had voted in the government of your choice, the government you wanted? No government has that kind of magic, because this is a very complex situation in Kashmir. It's a very big national challenge. Kashmir needs patience, realism, and, if I may dare to say so, some humility. Anybody who thinks that somebody can come and sort out everything in Kashmir in 3 days is mistaken. See, the Americans with all their might fought for 20 years in Afghanistan and failed. So Kashmir isn't quite Afghanistan. It has never been quite Afghanistan, and thank God for that. But it is not a problem which you can just blow the whistle and say, listen, so and so is coming, and the problem will disappear. It will not. No headline, even another catastrophic terror attack, God forbid, would take Kashmir away from India. We must understand the realities of Kashmir. No terror attack, God forbid, no matter what happens, nothing will take Kashmir away from India. Yet, no headline, even on the momentous 5th August 2019 decisions, would end the crisis in Kashmir, because crisis in Kashmir is much deeper. Now, we resolve the contradiction also in what I might have said earlier and what I am saying now. So, how did I hail the decision on Article 370, etc., as an audacious, bold one, and yet call the situation today unsatisfactory in the valley? Because in our view, in my view, that constitutional decision was set in a higher politico-strategic space, not in a tactical one on the ground in the valley. To expect that it was going to end terror, violence, alienation, and okay, if you so prefer to call it Islamized jihad in the valley, it was wishful thinking. Now, you might also say that the Modi government and the BJP are to blame for having oversold that as a brave new dawn and the end of darkness in the valley. But remember, they are politicians. They will declare victory at the slightest excuse. They have to. That is part of their professional character. Because they oversold it, that's why now their discomfiture is so great. That's why the Home Minister, National Security Advisor, Lieutenant Governor are all having crisis meetings. This when the total number of civilians killed in almost half of this year already, we are now almost past the first week of May, in half of this year is 19. It's 19 lives lost too many, but then remember, this is Kashmir Valley. Stuff happens there. Now, here is what the decision on Article 370, etc. meant politico-strategically. As long as this article was on the books and Kashmir had a special status in India, the rest of the world and especially Pakistan made the presumption that status of all of Jammu and Kashmir was negotiable. So they also lived on that hope. But 5th August 2019 ended that. Here on, message from India was J&K is a part of India like any other state, and while we are open to negotiations, all that's available for negotiation, all that is negotiable territory now is the territory you hold, or what we call Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So Modi government's success lies in the fact that the world, including the UN by and large, accepted this new fait accompli. That's why we call the decision a bold shift. The Pakistanis, on the other hand, also understood precisely what this meant. This had hit them when they were at their weakest internationally. That showed in Imran Khan government sharp reactions. So what did they do? They did the best they could, or from India's point of view, the worst they could. They roused what international support they still had, mainly China's. So one reason I believe the Chinese lit up the Ladakh frontier was to intercede on Pakistan's behalf to assert that they too were party to the Kashmir dispute, the Chinese too, because Aksai Chin is part of the map of original Kashmir in India, now the map of Ladakh, a union territory in India. So Chinese have a dispute with us over that, and also the Pakistanis have gifted some territory from Kashmir to China, that is the Shaksgam Valley. So now the Chinese are saying, look, we are also party to Kashmir dispute. Second option for Pakistan was the old one, which is revive terror in the valley. We are seeing the results right now. That's exactly what is happening. So once again, for clarity, the Modi government's Kashmir policy has been a success in changing the status of the valley and in redefining what remains negotiable. But since it oversold it to the faithful, to its own voters and its own followers, it looks a failure on the ground today. That is the price of repainting India's oldest and greatest national security challenge in politically partisan colors. You don't do that. If you call India's handling of Kashmir until 2014 muddling along, you might also describe the subsequent 8 years as more of the same, muddling along. Do you prefer that? I prefer to call it continuity with some significant change.